It is Monday, March the 25th, 2019. This is the Dissident Peasant Podcast, and I am your host, Jeff in Georgia. On today's show, the Troubadour of the Every-man. That's right, the Bard of Jane and John Doe, important in terms of music, politics, a fascinating life filled with drama, strangeness, and folk music. Pete Seeger. We're going to dive into Pete Seeger today, figure out what that dude was all about. But of course, before I get to that, just a reminder that this show, like all these shows, is brought to you by you, listeners who go to patreon.com/dissidentpeasant. I do need your support to keep up this work. I know I make it sound easy. It is not. So, if you want to let me know how much you appreciate it, in terms of dollars, go to patreon.com/dissidentpeasant. Also check out my PayPal link. That's paypal.me/dissidentpeasant. Thank you in advance for your support. I really appreciate it. If you can't afford to support me, don't fret. I just want to thank you for listening to the show. Once upon a time, during the height of the Vietnam War, a man went to a concert with malice on his mind and murder in his heart. See, this man had signed up for war with all his buddies and outlived a good number of them, ground up into so much grist for the war machine. The man he was heading to kill had had the gall to stand up and say that his buddies had died for no good reason at all. And he was a former card-carrying Communist Party member to boot. In fact, it was an open secret that his target was a dirty red. Probably wanted North Vietnam to win the war. Those very same people that killed his friends. But when that man finally stood face to face with Pete Seeger, he didn't kill him. Said he sang these words together with Pete. Left that concert a changed man. Said he felt clean. Where have all the flowers gone? Long time passing. Where have all the flowers gone long time ago? Where have all the flowers gone? Girls have picked them. Every one. When will they ever learn? When will we ever learn? The song goes on from there, and you can look at the lyrics if you want, but what's it all mean, huh? I mean, there's more than one good answer, I think, but for my part, it's about the lament of an artist who sees the cycle of war for the futile and never-ending enterprise that it is, and an exultation for others to see and learn. This essential humanist message is something Pete never lost, I think, in his long years. He drifted a bit here and there politically, but fundamentally he was a sensitive soul who did his best to cast his lot with the common person, whoever and wherever they might be. He held no public office, he commanded no armies, he amassed no great wealth, but he strummed his banjo, made his mandolin, and his guitar. He used his voice as both a vessel of tranquil reflection and roaring exhortation, and he never, ever gave up. Now, whatever I think that song means and you think that song means, Pete Seeger did live through that concert night, and indeed around 94 years worth of nights before he finally left his mortal coil. He lives on, of course, even in the minds of people who cannot recall his name or his picture. Anytime "We Shall Overcome" is sung, a little piece of him hovers in the air. The same goes for the Gullah spiritual Kumbaya and the Zulu song Awimawa, or The Lion Sleeps Tonight. He popularized all these songs and more. Many modern concert experiences owe something of their practice to Pete Seeger, with their emphasis on audience participation and engagement, though he is hardly alone in his contribution within the realm of American musicians to this phenomenon. But more than any other single person, he was responsible for the modern American folk music revival of the 1960s. In the realm of society and politics, he tussled with the FBI and McCarthyism, commercialism, and blacklists, and certainly could have made way more money than he did if he just sold out and played it safe. But because in part he didn't do that shit, here we are. So begins a little taste of the life of Pete Seeger, one of the most important political and cultural figures the United States of America has ever produced. Pete Seeger was born May 3rd, 1919, to Charles Louis Seeger Jr., and Constance DeCliver Seeger in Midtown Manhattan. Charles Seeger was a Harvard-educated composer who had helped found the music department at the University of Berkeley in 1912, a department he was actually forced to resign from in 1918 because of his outspoken pacifism during World War I. If you look him up, you'll often read that he was something called a musicologist, which is not a profession I think most people are familiar with, so I will tell you. Musicology is the scholarly and academic study of music, as opposed to the study of its composition and performance. It actually encompasses quite a few disciplines that don't really have anything to do with one another, except that they all involve music in some sense. Music history, ethnomusicology, this is like the anthropology of music basically, musical therapists, computational musicologists, even the discipline called music education that yours truly once pursued long ago, depending upon who you're talking to, are all considered elements of musicology. But as for Pete's father, Charles, he was the founding member of the American Musicology Society and concerned with definitions about singing style and the language used to describe music, as well as a researcher and teacher in ethnomusicology. His mother, Constance, was a classical violinist and teacher, and a really good one, too, trained at the Paris Conservatory and teaching at the Juilliard School, one of the finest music schools in the world. When Pete was 18 months old, his parents traveled from New York to the American South in a homemade automobile trailer to give performances of classical music across the small towns and rural farm communities of the American South. You know, to play them some Bach and Mozart and stuff, with Constance on the violin, Charles on the piano. Pete described the trip as a disaster, mishaps and delays, and lots of being forced to camp out. But it was one of the family's first experiences with the folk music of the time, because inevitably when Constance and Charles would conclude their concerts, the locals would emerge with their own instruments to play for them in turn, and even with them. It might not seem like much, but his parents did not press him to pursue a musical career, for which they really should be commended. Thus it was honestly that Pete came by his love of playing for others, despite being an otherwise fairly introverted man. First with the ukulele around the age of 8. But in 1936, as a young teenager, he traveled with his father and his stepmother to the Mountain Dance and Folk Festival in North Carolina, and he fell in love for the first time. Specifically, he fell in love with the 5-string banjo. With the possible exception of his voice, no other instrument is so associated with Pete Seeger as the banjo. He would spend the next 4 years, and indeed the rest of his life, attempting to master this instrument, and is so associated with it that his best-known book of all time is entitled How to Play the 5-String Banjo, a book many a banjoist has credited with introducing them to the instrument. The long-neck banjo, often just called the Seeger banjo, was invented by him. For those interested, it's 3 fret lengths longer at the neck than a traditional 5-string banjo and tuned minor third lower. Before Pete got his hands on it, the 5-string banjo was hitherto a regional curiosity, and with not a little help from another musician, whose introduction will occur soon, he helped make that instrument into a common staple of American music. But before he meets that musician, Pete needs to flunk out of Harvard. Now, through the combination of a scholarship, a part-time job, and a little help from his family, mostly his brothers, and not his parents, he would find out many years later, he got into Harvard. Now, Pete was never a dummy, was always curious and a big reader. But along with the banjo, politics began to distract him from his studies, and in 1938 he flunked out. In college, he joined the communists. The way Pete remembered it in an interview, the main debate within the coalition of socialists and communists was what to do about Nazi Germany during the run-up to World War II. One side advocated complete disengagement and pacifism. The other side advocated fighting and containing fascism. The communists mostly came down on the side of the fighting, and so did he, which is why Pete joined the communists. I'll talk more about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939. And in addition, the communists were integrated and pro-union, so it wasn't really a hard question for him. He joined the Young Communist League. And in 1942, he joined the Communist Party of the United States of America. However, now that Harvard is off the table, he'll spend a few months as, believe it or not, a traveling puppeteer in 1939. This was a tour about unionization and politics and always, what they, the farmers, could do to more closely align themselves with labor in the cities. Before he nailed a sweet gig in Washington, D.C. at the National Archives, where his job was to help sift through recordings to pick out what was best representative of American folk music at the time. He also began to appear on the radio with someone very important. If Pete Seeger is the father of the American folk music revival and its leftist infusion, then Woody Guthrie is the grandfather. Now, despite being close to the same age, Woody would die much younger than Pete, and would already be quite ill at the height of the turbulent 60s, but he was starting now the sensei to Pete's disciple. The radio broadcasts they did with others were notable in that they were integrated, not at all the norm in the early 40s. And despite being considered good enough to be called to the White House for command performances for at least 3 cabinet secretaries, that integration was enough to keep the show away from national broadcasts. And for not the last time, they teamed up, and they actually hopped freight trains and rambled together for a time after this. Pete would describe this as being allowed to tag along with Woody. In 1941, the 21-year-old Seeger hit it big for the first time with his group, the Almanacs, and their plan to start a singing labor movement. Now, the content of their songs reflected mostly the Soviet party line at the time, criticizing Roosevelt for an unprecedented peacetime draft, and resistant to dying in Brazil for Lord DuPont, for example. Seeger and other communists, though nominally a part of the Popular Front of anti-fascist liberals, socialists, and communists allied with the Roosevelt administration, remembered the arms embargo to Republican Spain before its descent into fascism and imperial muckery in South America. Pun intended, after the Americans entered the war, the Almanac's tune changed considerably, and they became very supportive of the war effort. But it didn't matter. They were now marked. Though the war's draft will soon interrupt their career trajectory, this marking will subsist when they reform in 1950. Before that, though, speaking of war, Pete's got to go, like most men did at the time. He spent some time being trained by the Army as an airplane mechanic, but I doubt he ever had the chance to fix even one machine before Uncle Sam decided he was far more valuable strumming his banjo than covered in grease under a plane. So that's what he did during the war. Not heroic or dangerous service, but service, nonetheless. And during that service, he got married. If there's anything Pete loved more than his banjo, it was Toshi. Toshi and Pete met first in 1939, where she helped him organize and manage his music book. Over the weeks working with him, the close conditions grew into love. When the war came for Pete, Toshi said she'd wait for him, and she did. While on leave from the Pacific Front in 1943, they married, and this is where the old saw about what lies behind a good man goes, right? Well, I want to be absolutely clear. Without Toshi, there is no Pete Seeger. All that rambling across the country, all the turning down of the commercial contracts, the home she literally helped build out in the middle of nowhere in New York with no plumbing or electricity, the managing and materializing of his dreams, and yes, the children she raised. It was Toshi that allowed Pete to be who he was, follow his dreams. And it was Toshi that was the foundation of Pete's personal and professional success. And you don't need to take my word for it. Pete said the very same. After getting married and leading song workshops in Saipan, he came home from the war. He became incredibly interested in spreading the songs of the labor movement to be played during meetings and rallies of organized labor. And as Pete told it, quote, almost as soon as the war was over, Roosevelt was dead, Truman took over, we hadn't foreseen the Cold War, end quote. During work on his People's Songbook, when they weren't digging through his trash or bugging his office's typewriters, the FBI was planning informants. Like many other lefties at the time, he supported the campaign of Henry Wallace in 1948. Pete Seeger actually traveled the country with Wallace for months. Seeger considered him the peace candidate with the Soviets, not the communist candidate, whatever the FBI might think. You may recall, dear listener, one other musical supporter of Henry Wallace, Paul Robeson, one of the finest American classical vocalists of all time, didn't share Seeger's politics exactly. He remained a communist officially, whereas Seeger left the party in 1949, though Pete would continue to argue with his communist friends for the rest of his life and would never betray them, even under threat of prison. But Comrade Robeson was a comrade, and so when he asked Pete if he would please come to a concert he was putting on in Peekskill and sing a few songs for the benefit of the Civil Rights Congress, Pete agreed, whether he was feeling particularly communist that day or not. In that large New York field, the Star-Spangled Banner was sung, America the Beautiful, a bit of Chopin, Bach, Prokofiev, Ravel was played, Seeger sang, of course. Robeson's set was really the main attraction. The concert went great. The aftermath, if you'll recall, not so much. Rioters approached the concertgoers, dispersing the field, and hurled rocks, quote, big as baseballs, as Pete remembers. Every window in their car was shattered, which carried Pete, Woody, Toshi, his infant kids, and the amazing bass singer Lee Hayes, and according to one of Pete's kids, Pete's father-in-law, Takashi. Woody Guthrie pinned a shirt up in the window to protect them from the shattered glass. Quote, wouldn't you know it, Woody pinned up a red shirt, end quote, Hayes recalled. All the while, the police simply watched. Now, as I said before, in 1950, some of the pre-war almanacs reconstituted as the Weavers. Their arrangement of Goodnight, Irene, first taught to them by the recently deceased legendary Huddy William Ledbetter, better known as Lead Belly, and to whom they absolutely gave credit at the time, topped the charts for 13 weeks in 1950. This was not their only hit, but they were big ballers around this time when their career trajectory abruptly changed. What changed? Was it changing tastes in music among people? Maybe rock and roll? Maybe a disruptive new technology? Materialist economic forces? None of that. It was the Red Scare. They were actually offered a national television show sponsored by Van Camp's Pork and Beans till the blacklist began. That very week, the offer was withdrawn. At the peak of their popularity, radio stations suddenly ceased playing their records. Stores pulled them from sale. Charles Seeger had to resign a teaching post before he was fired. Many of his mother Constance's students began to desert the family for fear of being associated with them. But Pete pressed on. As I've said before, and I'll say it again, you can recognize every great beacon of freedom and liberty of the 20th century in America quite easily by just looking at who the FBI and House Un-American Activities Committee were going after. And of course, Pete was way too damn popular and talented not to get dragged in front of them. He didn't tell them shit. If you look into it, you may read that Seeger exercised his rights under the Fifth Amendment not to give testimony that might be self-incriminating. This is incorrect. Seeger actually refused to answer the committee's questions on First Amendment grounds, that his political beliefs, associations, or how he voted in any election are his own business, and that questions about that sort of thing in the context of a congressional inquisition or law enforcement action is pretty improper. All this take plenty of time to sort out, but in 1957 he was finally indicted for contempt of Congress. In 1961 he was convicted, sentenced to 10 one-year terms in jail to be served concurrently. In 1962, his conviction was finally overturned on appeal. But in the meantime, all that, he needed money. So Pete traveled the country, hitting summer camps, music schools, conservatories, colleges, taking gigs wherever he could find them, and becoming really a legendary figure in the burgeoning folk revival movement, a movement that was beginning to creep into urban areas. City billies became a thing, not least because of Pete Seeger, but please, under no circumstances should you confuse a city billy for a rockabilly. In many ways, it was these years, and not his wider commercial success before and after this, that really cemented his position as a true countercultural phenomenon, as opposed to just a cultural one. Kids were actually the only people the FBI would let him sing for unharassed for many years, and weirdly, this was not thought by the FBI to be a problem. But many a child who might have languished untouched by the beauty of Pete Seeger was introduced to music because of this quirk of history. He met Martin Luther King Jr. twice. He is one reason you know the song We Shall Overcome in the form that you do. Now, he did not write that song, of course, it being a traditional African-American gospel spiritual, but it was Pete who changed the will to shall, added a couple more of the popular verses. He also sang it for Martin Luther King Jr. once in 1957. According to MLK's driver afterwards, it was during this car ride that Dr. King got the song stuck in his head. This version stuck in other heads too, notably Guy Carawan, who learned it from someone else who had learned it from Pete. He taught the song to Julian Bond and others at the founding meeting of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Joan Baez, who led a crowd of 300,000 in the singing of We Shall Overcome during the 1963 March on Washington, said she learned it from Pete, who also sang it for everyone on the 50-mile walk from Selma to Montgomery. Pete was always characteristically modest about his own musical influences and importance to the music world, but this was simply his way to view his true mission as bringing others together. You shouldn't let it deceive you into not recognizing just how important a musician he was, as well as an activist. The blacklist keeping him off television finally began to crumble in the mid-60s, first with a regionally broadcast educational show for children about folk music called Rainbow Quest. 39 episodes of this ran. Towards the end, according to Pete's recollection, they were basically operating at a loss and producing it themselves. But it maybe helped keep his name out there, as the nationally broadcast Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour finally shattered the blacklist for good and invited him to come on and play a set. CBS complained a little about their choice, but did agree without too much trouble, and Seeger finally appeared on national television again in September of 1967. The final song he played that night was a little minor key ditty called Waist Deep in the Big Muddy. It's a little ballad. It tells the story of a captain leading a platoon of soldiers on a wet and swampy night. Now, said captain orders his troops to ford a river, quote, knee deep in the big muddy. And the big fool said to push on. Now, the men and the sergeant aren't so sure about all this, thinking the water's a little deep, their packs a bit heavy for this nonsense, but the captain basically calls them weak before getting sucked under the water by a pool of quicksand and drowning. As the song goes, quote, now I'm not going to point to any moral. I'll leave that for yourself. But maybe you're still walking, you're still talking, you'd like to keep your health. And every time I read the papers, that bold feeling comes on. We're waist deep in the big muddy, and the big fool says to push on. That's pretty obvious who he's talking about. It's LBJ. Previously attacked by Seeger through satire as Mrs. J's little son Albie, with beans in his ears on the album Dangerous Songs? Now, CBS pissed themselves when they heard this, and they edited out the song. And it was only through the protestations of the Smothers Brothers themselves and Seeger's fans that led to wide publicity of said pants pissing. It was several months later that CBS came back hat in hand and let him tell the simple little story of a fool in a flood. We're running a little long today, so we'll pick up next episode. Pete gets a little bit older, makes a few friends in North Vietnam, keeps strumming that banjo. Oh, he's gonna clean up the Hudson River, he's gonna visit Occupy Wall Street, and just generally be a really radical dude. See you next time.
What did you learn in school today, dear little boy of mine? What did you learn in school today, dear little boy of mine? I learned that Washington never told a lie. I learned that soldiers seldom die. I learned that everybody's free. That's what the teacher said to me, and that's what I learned in school today. That's what I learned in school. What did you learn in school today, dear little boy of mine? What did you learn in school today, dear little boy of mine? I learned that policemen are my friends. I learned that justice never ends. I learned that murderers die for the crimes, even if we make a mistake sometime. And that's what I learned in school today. That's what I learned in school. What did you learn in school today, dear little boy of mine? What did you learn in school today, dear little boy of mine? I learned our government must be strong. It's always right and never wrong. Our leaders are the finest men, and we elect them again and again. And that's what I learned in school today. That's what I learned in school. What did you learn in school today, dear little boy of mine? What did you learn in school today, dear little boy of mine? I learned that war is not so bad. I learned about the great ones we have had. We fought in Germany and in France, and someday I might get my chance. And that's what I learned in school today. That's what I learned in school.